performance down in the bucket, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it goes transonic.
Want to right now? I don't know.
Well, that's just it. Can we, should we? Well, here's another fun one though. Here's a legitimately fun one that popped up yesterday that is tied to basketball. I'm watching, who am I watching? Dallas and the Phoenix Suns.
Mm-hmm.
So Dallas plays the Suns last night. It's in Phoenix. First quarter, call it 7 minutes into the game. Phoenix comes out to a high single-digit, low double-digit lead. And they're hitting everything. And Dallas is missing everything. And they go to either a TV timeout or Jason Kidd calls a timeout. Coach of the Mavericks calls a timeout.
Yeah.
And they come back from the timeout. And the sideline reporter comes on like they do sort of, before the team comes back on the court and says, Jason Kidd was really optimistic during that time. In fact, he even held up a clipboard that said good start in capital letters to the team. And here you've got a team that's like down by, like I said, high single digits, down by 9. And their coach is writing good start. And so they elaborate on it a bit and they go, well, the reason why he's saying that is basically they're taking good shots. They're controlling the flow of the game. They're playing good defense. It just so happens that Phoenix is hitting the shots. And all I could think about was the conversations that you and I keep having starting 15 years ago when I met you about the over-reliance and focus on results.
Totally.
And how in this case, the result, if you pause the game, was Dallas is getting killed. But in actual fact, all of the actions and activities leading up to that poor result were actually viewed really positively by the coach of the team because they're doing all the right things. And it's like,
hey man, it's the same thing right now. I don't know if you've been paying attention to markets today. Bloodbath, like everything. Okay. And I've been following along like I do most days on various sources, looking at different things. And like people right now are max fear, Bitcoin's going to zero, blah, 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 all this stuff, like it's Armageddon. And this is the problem with this line of thinking is, yeah, sure, right now, depending on your time scale. So you're talking about first quarter of a basketball game.
First 7 minutes.
There's a lot of basketball left. You're not even done the first quarter.
Yeah.
So right there, if you want to go and say, how's it going? And you look only at the outcome, you go, well, they suck. Except if you know what you're looking for more deeply, you go, wait a second. And that's the same thing. Like there's indicators, for example, that Purpose Bitcoin ETF that both you and I are invested in had significant inflows yesterday, probably because things were rolling up or because smart people went, okay, Fed's just signaled they're not going to go to 75 basis points. There's all this economic data coming out right now that says things are difficult. This thing's going to reverse eventually. Money flowed in.
Yeah.
Now, if you take a longer term view, if you zoom out, people say this, right? Zoom out, look at the chart over a long period of time, use the logarithmic charts, etc. You'd argue right now, this is fantastic. It's fire sale. It's on sale right now.
Yeah.
So if you're somebody that got liquidated because you've been over leveraged and you need to make your, $50,000 balloon car payment tomorrow, that might hurt. And you bought it 64,000. Yeah. Then you're kind of fucked. It all depends on your perspective. And I think the other point that you're making is the coach, Jason Kidd, not only played, he's a good coach. He knows what he's looking for. He's watching things the scoreboard doesn't tell you.
Okay. So I was going to say, this is interesting. If you only look at the ticker, you're only told one side of the story, but you've got to actually dig into the game.
Correct.
Right. So like if you're the guy who's watching, let's say, in basketball, there's like a second feed on, or maybe you're watching the hockey Stanley Cup playoffs.
Yep.
At the bottom comes by, Dallas 7, Phoenix 22. And you're like, oh, well, they're getting destroyed. It's like, well, yeah, when you look at just the ticker, they're getting destroyed, but dig into it, get more involved. The coach is involved. The coaching staff is involved. They know what's going on. They're a part of the game. But like, even when you think about businesses, it's like, oh, well, we're back to your point about the stock market. It's like, oh, well, look at that. They did horribly. Everything's got to be bad. Was the management team shit? Are the employees shit? Like, have you actually looked into the organization, or did you just look at the ticker?
Yeah, well, and this is so Kathy Wood from ARC has been getting beaten up big time because like that ETF's down a ton. Except she comes back on all the time and says, yeah, except our investment horizon is 5 years. And we're looking at deep analysis on a bunch of fundamentals within the business, trends in the sector, blah, blah, blah. And that's why we're picking the companies we're picking. And so same deal, like people are like, oh my God, she's horrible. Well, over what time frame? Because everyone's horrible. The market's horrible. And the market's like everybody, right? If you look at the markets in the first quarter of or first year to date, whatever, of 2022, everything's shitty. So are you now more shitty just because? So
Well,
again, if you're somebody that wanted to get in and out because you're trading on wild swings and short-term volatility, yeah, you could make an argument that it hasn't performed to your time horizon and expectations. But to be able to say this is a shitty person who's, not got the right thesis, and even from an outcomes basis, like she's not winding the fund up today. She's not locking in all those losses today.
Yeah.
The funds have a lifespan. So everybody time out a bit on this and wait to see what the result is over a longer period of time. And yeah, you know what? Hey, look, end of the day, Dallas might have lost that game. I didn't watch it, so
and they did.
Okay, so they lost the game, but have they lost the series yet? No.
Yeah, exactly.
Are they still even though they lost the game? Is it because they didn't play well, or is it because the other team just played better? Like, again, it's nuance. There's a bunch of nuance to this. And this is the same thing with the conversation we were having this morning about the marketing stuff. Like, because there's a lack of depth, because of a lack of knowledge and experience, you get into this conversation that's at this very high level, like the one I've been in, right? Where marketing me, and it's like, guys, you're not thinking about this deeply enough because you don't have the experience or the knowledge. You think you do, and your ego says you should participate, but you don't know what you're talking about. So you'd actually be better off to just be quiet. Well, and let some of us who actually have been there, done that, and know the space, let us have a conversation about that so that you can get up to speed. Because my concern here is it's the blind leading the blind. And you could, again, take that to coaching. Like, if Jason Kidd wasn't Jason Kidd and it was some guy in the crowd who'd never played basketball,
yeah,
and even though it might happen to be lucky, good advice, fair enough. But who's it coming from?
Well, who's
it coming from? You got to look at the source.
So here's another fantastic one that's tied to the source and tied to data and analytics and the frustration we have around that one. And going back to basketball, I heard there's a stat that like Steph Curry shoots something like 17, 15, whatever, threes a game. Like it's a pretty obscene amount, right? And I can't remember the name of the GM of the Golden State Warriors, but I guess in a conversation he was having with Draymond Green, Draymond asked him, how many shots should Steph be taking according to analytics? And I guess this guy, the GM, had gotten counsel from the analytics team, which is like the thing in basketball right now, analytics, that he should shoot 20 a game. And 20 a game is the magic number. And Draymond's reaction to that was like, do you know how exhausting it is to try to get up 20 shots the way Steph Curry plays? Like, we're not, and they made a reference to a former NBA player named Tim Legler. They're like, this isn't the kind of shot where you just free up off a screen and get a shot. Like, he's running his ass off trying to get open looks, and then he's creating his own shot.
Yeah.
So if you want him to get 20 shots, there's a risk of injury. There's a risk of fatigue. There's a risk of, not sharing them. Like, there's a bunch of other risks. And it's like, well, what's the source of these analytics in the first place? Like, how can we rely on these kind of analytics? And to your point, like, who's coming up with them? These guys haven't played. So like, you've got Draymond Green, a perennial all-star for a bit of his career. I'm sure him and Steph have talked about this. He happened to be talking to JJ Redick, who's known to be probably one of the top 3-5 3-point shooters of all time, who's just retired. And they're kind of like, 20 shots? Like, who are these goofballs in analytics? And it's like, wow, that's your analytics.
Yeah, well, and this is back to where I think you need to have, this reminds me of the conversation we had with Randy about what does it take to be successful with AI projects, right? And again, we talked about those three conditions. You need to have data. You need to have a problem to solve that's definable that the data will address, but then you need the subject matter expertise. And that includes the experience to be able to help frame this and even model how you start to clean data, do all this stuff. And as you and I talk about all the time, there's a lot of folks that are fans in the stand in terms of like what that is. They're the recipients of the score on the scoreboard. They have no idea what it takes to actually produce the result. And a lot of those happen to be people that are decision makers and they don't really get it. And unless you've done it like we do, unless you're in the data, but you also have the broader perspective, it's really hard to know what to do. And whether it's a basketball game and coaching, whether it's, a business problem, whether it's the market, whether it's politics, like look at, all of these analytical models. I would argue the analytical software and statistical modeling that goes on with these big research firms that do polling are probably as big as they've ever been in the history of the world. And guess what? They still can't predict outcomes. Except you and I, back in 2016, when everyone thought we were crazy, we're like, Trump's going to win the election. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, because we could look at data differently. And we could factor in the intangibles too, where there's a little bit of intangible here that you're not going to see in numbers. You have to actually have a little bit. This is the art of that stuff, right? It's not just the science. And I think too many people think it's scientific, and it's a mixture of both skill sets.
That's, and we should like revisit this at some point. But you remember a long time ago, I came up with this idea of computation, conversation, and observation.
Yep.
As sort of the three modalities that you need to have to understand a situation.
Yep.
And the analytics thing takes into account computation. And it seems to be the only one, and it seems to be the flavor of the day. And it's like, well, what happens? And this is the great thing about sports, to keep going back on it. The athletes will always be like, I watch the game, like I look with my eyes and see what's going on. Well, that's observation, right? Like you can watch the game and go, that player makes the right reads. Now you can overlay analytics on that and help to support that hypothesis or that, that test, that eye test that, you'd call it. You could overlay analytics on top of that, but like they both need to exist. And ideally all three exist. There needs to be conversation. Go talk to people. Like in the Trump example, when you and I were down in Austin, Texas. Nashville. And we were outside of Santa's pub in Nashville, and we were having a conversation with people talking about issues. And you go, well, there's a whole world of people out here who are having different issues than the issues that you see on CNN. And not that we were like pumping Trump up, but like you just had to have a conversation for 10 minutes with people to go, oh, there's a whole undercurrent of something else going on here that's not being captured by polling stations. And then we were right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also the folks that had the opinions of there's no way, they live in their little ivory tower worlds of New York and LA, and like that's what happens. And they don't go and travel around middle America. They're not going to go to Santa's pub when they go to Nashville. Let's just say that. Okay.
Right.
Right. Because you and I seek that stuff out. Like we're going to go to we're going to go to Pig, Kentucky and have coffee because we can. And it's interesting.
Yeah. Where they still
a lot of people
they still smoke inside the cafe.
Yeah. And and it's like from the 1970s or 60s, maybe. So yeah, I think it's a lot of those things. I mean, the other thing about conversation, you talked about conversation, not just computation. Don't get me wrong. The players are very aware. Like if you're a guy, because you and I both played, right? If you're a guy that's missing free throws, you're missing a lot of free throws. You also know when you're making a lot of free throws. But guess what also helps on the court, which again, the average fan doesn't see, the amount of talking that's going on and communicating on those teams on the floor is significant. And you've got the coach on the sideline that's yelling and they're doing that. But the players, if it's a good team, they communicate in a variety of ways on the court as well. So they're doing all of that real time. Like they're processing all of that feedback real time. And the guys that are really good at it, I mean, and this is back to, I'm going to kind of take us off on a bit of a tangent. This is on chemistry. We talked about teams will screw up chemistry amongst players. Like you've told me the story of when you were had that 3-on-3 team when you were younger, and you guys had played together for years, so you all knew each other so well, like you would win. And so yes, you had to be skilled, but you guys also just, you knew each other so well. It's like you and I with the consulting work, how often do we ever talk about who's going to do what? We never do, because we just do what we do and it works. Because there's chemistry. You can't, it's very hard to replicate that, because I think it just happens. And I think when it happens, people don't appreciate how important it is. Yep. And they want to disrupt it. I mean, we've talked about, again, back to basketball, you've got players that rotate around. They never fit. They never gel. You see certain teams, like even Toronto this year. Toronto's got a bunch of guys. These are not necessarily, some of them are, but not very many are like, top table talk NBA type people. But somehow that bench, and when those guys come out and they play together, they're winning. Yep. Now they got taken out in the first round. Fair enough. They lost to Philadelphia. But like some of what those guys did, when you start to really dig in and look at how much that team is a team, eventually that's going to pay off. Because I think they have a philosophy, and this comes from management and ownership, that's what they want to create there. And it's why they recruit the guys they recruit. It's why they develop the guys they develop. And it's pretty incredible.
Well, the other thing,
but you got to be deliberate.
Back to the recruiting side on that, there are organizations in the NBA like the Miami Heat, at least I think they're one of these cases, that other players seek to go to, because they're known for being an organization that builds the culture.
Yep.
And so even that, right, being able to sort of quantify and qualify what that is, and then promote it as such to actually acquire the right talent, and have folks going like, I want to go play there because they will treat me well, and they will build culture, and they will build a team chemistry that I won't get from, the Sacramento Kings. So don't trade me over to Sacramento. Now Miami's got its own, allure in other ways, but like Miami as a franchise has been a powerhouse, since the LeBron, Dwayne Wade, Bosh, and even before then with Shaq and Dwayne Wade on their first championship. And it's been that way ever since. They've kept the same coach. They recruit the same type of players. Even players that are exceptional still have low ego, which I think is maybe not so much LeBron, but the rest of them. They're still somewhat humble. They always have a glue guy on the team that keeps things together. Yeah. And it's like, that's deliberate. Like somewhere in that organization, they're going, these are the kinds of pieces we need to keep this thing running.
Yeah.
And as a result, they've got huge enterprise value.
Yep. And I would argue this. They could write those attributes down on a piece of paper. That still wouldn't come close to those scouts and that management team being able to see a player.
Yep.
And know that's a good fit.
Yep.
Just go like, this guy's got a shot.
To the player, meet with them, meet with their mom and dad, which is what recruits do with college kids, right? Coming out of high school into college.
Yeah.
See where they're from, go to their hometown, have dinner with the parents. Well,
and we're going to get into the topic now that we've talked about one of our favorites of how shitty recruiting is when it comes to business people.
Yeah.
Because the recruiter typically has never, ever walked in the player's shoes, let's say. Not really. And they're pushing paper, looking for keywords and resumes, and then having an interview where you can have like, I remember, I've told you this story, my P&G recruiting experience, like this is for a kid coming out of university for an entry-level job. The process involved a first interview in person with two people for like over an hour, a second interview with a bunch of other people, and then, because that was the second cut, and then those of us that got lucky enough to go to like the third piece was a full day immersed in the sales office in Calgary, having interviews, conversations, doing exercises with them, essentially evaluating you amongst the other people that were there that were also on the short list.
Yep.
Like it was, I don't know, it was probably 10, 12 hours of their time. And then they had meetings after that, because I know the process now after the fact, because I was involved in it after the fact, being one of those people, recruiting people. That's what it was. Like, it was crazy. And they did that for like entry level people. So I think now about some of what you and I've been experiencing with clients or other organizations we're involved with, where, you know, they want to recruit somebody onto a board and it's like a 30-minute phone interview or, you know, whatever. And then we make a decision. It's insane.
Yeah.
It's insanity.
Well,
How the hell are you going to learn anybody or get to understand how they play on the court with other people doing what 90% of the firms out there do when they're trying to go and recruit talent? It's insanity.
Yep. Well, and even in the in your example, and mine was similar. I didn't have a 12-hour day, but I had an initial interview. Then I had a second interview with a case study. The case study then had to be presented as part of sort of the third interview. At the end of that case study was a dinner then out with the president of the company. And then the final step was meeting the rest of the team to make sure that we fit. And then you were selected. So what's interesting is that process was very structured in terms of those steps, but there was room within those steps for unstructured conversation.
Yes,
like
totally.
through the dinner, right? It wasn't, and we've moved on one of the boards that I'm on, we've moved to some more unstructured conversation around the recruitment of other board directors, thankfully, because previously it was like, here's the check boxes we want to see if you can check off before you join this board. And it's like, well, that's like, we all look great on our resumes. Like, you want to see me check boxes on what I'm good at? Like, just give me a piece of paper and I'll check them all. Like, it's kind of crazy, right? Like, can we have a conversation about this and make sure we're both a fit? Like, this is bilateral. This isn't just tell me what you can do for me and check the boxes. That never works.
No.
So like, even back to conversation, like I would almost make the argument that the checkbox exercise is a computation exercise and it's missing observation and conversation. And in the examples that you had, and like you, my first job, the example you had and the example I had all three modalities. You had to answer questions and you had to do some stuff. You had to compute things. Then you went and had a conversation with multiple people, and then you were being observed. In my case, I had to present. In your case, you had a full day of being in the office where you were being observed.
But you know what's funny about that? Here's what's funny about that is I would argue co-op programs are similar, right? Co-op programs, or even the one that Josh is involved in right now. So, you know, I've told you, my son Josh is doing an internship with a company out of Toronto called Neighborhood Creative, which he kind of created because they didn't even have a posting. He just, you know, DM'd these guys and created his own opportunity. Cool thing, he's doing an internship now. They're going to see how he performs doing work that they need him to do over the course of 4 months.
Yep.
And co-op students get that same experience. What's funny, and again, back to sports, same deal, is if you said to an executive, you're now on a co-op program with us for the next 6 months, and then we'll think about it, their egos are so big that would never happen. Much like in sports, if you said to an elite basketball player, you know, here's a 6 month, let's try it out and see what happens, they go, no, I've earned this. And I would almost argue the stakes are so much higher with the executive recruitment, or, you know, the next LeBron recruitment versus the internship. Like it's almost backwards, right? It's like, wow. And the other thing that I think is funny, and again, you and I have seen this even with clients recently, is so-and-so's got the resume and look at what they did over there. It's like, yeah, but that's over there. They've now got to come and play in our system.
Yeah.
And you see this all the time, right? I mean, this is why a lot of CEOs, it's a revolving door. You know, yeah. They come in and they're unsuccessful. They don't fit, they fail, they leave. Yep. And then you try the next guy. And you know, eventually you get somebody that sticks for a while. But just because you were successful on that team, in that condition, in that era, in that whatever, doesn't necessarily translate across to you're now going to be successful in this system, because it's a different system.
Well, and
it's a completely different thing.
And the converse is true, which is ignored almost entirely, which is they weren't successful in the system over there, but probably could be over here.
Correct.
And trying to recognize what are the sort of the factors that person has over there that will translate well over here. That maybe
I know, but that's the Moneyball thing, right? Like that's the Moneyball.
Yeah.
all these guys get overlooked. We can pick them up cheap. But guess what? Fundamentally, against the system we're trying to create here, like, let's get on base. If we get on base, we win games. These guys get on base or create opportunities for people to get on base or prevent the other team from getting on base. Yeah. But because they're not the typical what you'd look for, they get overlooked by everybody else. And that diamond in the rough idea that you just sort of brought up, like, well, let's look at those that haven't been successful, but fundamentally have the attributes that would give them at least an opportunity. I don't think anybody does that.
Well, a famous one in the business context is, oh, look at how much this person's jumped around. Look, they were a year here, 2 here, 1 here, 3 here, 1 here. They must not be good. Really? Or they're so capable that they've worked themselves out of their situation in every single instance and can't handle being around the other people in the organization and need to find a place that fits.
Hey, dude, I mean, you know my story. The longest position I'd had anywhere before you and I decided to do this consulting stuff was 4 years.
Yeah.
It was the longest I'd ever been. But guess what? You go from P&G to starting a company to taking it public to starting another one to going to a mid-sized company to scaling it up. Like, that's how you get the breadth of experience.
Yeah.
That's how you get that breadth of experience, is if you stay in one place for too long, you can't adapt. You don't learn the skills of adaptation. And I'm not suggesting at all that go find people that have been someplace only 6 months, except you do have to think about it from the perspective of someone that's been around a bit, probably brings a perspective that's going to be quite different than the person that's only been in one place for their entire career.
And I just think in either case, don't be dismissive.
No,
That'd
I agree.
The argument. Just don't be dismissive one way or the other.
I agree. And I think, again, it depends on the role, because if you need a specialist that has a very specific set of skills and you're going to put them in a little box and let them just crank away, in their little activity, well, yeah, maybe go find the 30-year person, because they're the best, they're the best mechanic at fixing, these specific types of transmissions. Then that's all they're ever going to do. If you need somebody that's going to be a bit more dynamic and adapt and adjust, or be involved in a role that sort of has to float around a bit and has to be, risk, not risk averse, risk taking, maybe you do want someone that's not afraid to kind of do that. But those questions, even in terms of framing role descriptions, are usually lacking. That's not been a thought process that's come to the table, that's deliberate, that allows you to then go and say, this is the pool of candidates we're looking for.
Well, how about this? I would imagine most organizations are putting problem solving as one of the number 1 or 2 items on the list of qualities they want in a candidate. Mm-hmm. Probably number 1, especially today with how complex the world is. And it's like, okay, well, if that's what you're looking for, then it would not be a stretch to think folks that have developed those skills have A, had to see a lot of problems, B, had to solve them, but had to see a lot of problems, and had to see a lot of problems of varying degrees across varying domains, across a variety of industries and sectors, across a number of different disciplines, let's say, problems in marketing, problems in HR, problems in big companies, problems in small companies. And so then you go, well, then it would sort of stand to reason that that person's resume probably also looks like a dog's breakfast, because it would sort of necessitate that type of individual. So it's like, if problem solving is the most important thing, then the next most important thing in terms of what you're looking for is a candidate that's been all over the place.
Well,
you're probably more likely to find the right fit when you look for that type of candidate.
I bring it back to the work you and I've done for 14 years. We've worked across, I tallied it up a while ago. I haven't done it recently. As of a couple of years ago, when the last time I looked at this, I think you and I had worked on projects across 20 different sectors.
Yeah.
With about 50 different organizations. And that's why, as you and I know, when we try and talk to people and they go, what do you do? It's hard to describe. It's like, well, we go in and solve problems for organizations at a very senior level that are complex. That's what we do. And it's like, well, how do you do that? Well, we just have the skills to be able to go in and assess the problems. And by the way, the problems, irrespective of sector or company, tend to be similar-ish enough that you get to do that. And we figure stuff out. We've always been able to figure stuff out. That's why. Like, I find this so interesting, right? When you think about the way Remember you and I talked about this in medicine. This is the irony of medicine, right? Or the hypocrisy of medicine in some respects. The quote unquote higher up you go, the longer you have to go to school, the narrower you get.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So now I've not only got my medical degree, I now have gone and done a fellowship in cardiovascular medicine, and then I've done another fellowship on aortic, valve inflammation, blah blah blah, and now I'm out here. Okay, well, this down here, that sort of, I might have a breadth of medical experience. Like, when's the last time you thought that way? And now you get paid to not think like that. You get paid to think about this. And then, as we've talked about with personal experiences, you look at now the inability, unless you're able to match up the patient with that particular thing, with that specialist who goes bing, to get through that hoop now of people that can actually assess and diagnose something effectively. It's brutal.
Yeah, well,
it's brutal. Like the stories of people, going in and presenting and getting sent home, and going in and presenting and getting sent home, and because those skill sets aren't there. And even the GPs, they're not necessarily doing that anymore, because we've essentially taken those folks, because they're not respected, because it's not respected if you're in medicine. That's sort of the lowest rung on the ladder. They are seeing pretty basic stuff that you could probably get a very highly skilled nurse or somebody else to sort of get in the way, and they're not incented to kind of, it's just weird, Yeah,
well, and I think a primary component to that is that the presenting problem is often not the actual problem.
Correct.
And so, it's like, when you think of, like, if you've ever gone to a physiotherapist, like, they're remarkable at this. You go in and you say, my knee hurts. They start looking at the knee. They'll spend like 30 seconds on the knee and then tell you that the issue is tight hip flexor. And you're like, a tight hip flexor is the reason my knee is bothering me? And like, you've got tight hip flexors and a weak glute, and your shoulders are rounded forward and your posture sucks, and you've got an anterior pelvic tilt. And so what you need to do is strengthen your glutes first, and you've got a lack of mobility in your ankle. And you're like, oh, thanks. And that's why my knee hurts. It's like, yeah. And so they don't send you to the knee specialist, who, if they did, would just give you knee surgery and put a bionic plate in your knee, because what your actual, diet is reduce food, reduce less stress on your knee, and start working on your glutes and lengthening your hamstrings. It's like, oh, well, thanks. And business is the same way, right? We've got an issue over here. This is our issue. It's like, is it though? Because the diagnostic skills required to actually identify what the real problem are often very different than the specialist who diagnosed it the first time or in the first place.
Well, we've run into this recently with a client. Their definition of the problem from one of the executives is, I need more programming horsepower. We don't have enough capacity. We need more and more and more resources. I'm never going to get it done. That's the frame of reference for that individual. You and I know the real problem is they haven't dialed in narrowly enough an actual focus for what the problem the product can solve is, so that they can then say, okay, this is now the value proposition. It's not this, it's this. We're going to go and take that to market in this specific set of verticals. We're going to try that out, which then means all this other stuff on the programming wish list we don't need, but you got to add these two components that currently aren't even there, or they're buried so low because the list is so long. And so again, what's the problem? Well, the problem fundamentally isn't I need 40 more programmers. The problem is you guys haven't defined what your product is and what problem it's trying to solve and what you really need to take to market, because you're saying it's everything. And if it's everything, it's nothing. It can't be anything.
Yeah.
And that is the fundamental challenge, is it's a lack of integrating those pieces through their system to go, oh, so I could create efficiency here then. We don't need a team to worry about that for now. We could focus on this instead of that. We need to reorient this over here. Let's drop all those other initiatives. They could save time, save resources, be more effective and more productive. But all it is a narrowing of scope against what the fundamental problem is. But again, that comes back to a product-oriented marketing, big strategic marketing-oriented solution to the problem that currently doesn't exist within their experience base of their leadership. And so now you've got all this toing and froing, and you and I sit back and go, guys, that's the issue. That happens all the time. Yep. That happens all the time. And you're right. It's not about the knee, right? So in that, to bring the analogies across, right? The CPO saying, I've got a knee problem. I've got a knee problem. I need a brace. I need braces. You need to give me braces and crutches. And like, I need all that. And like, it's actually, no, it's the hip flexor. It has nothing to do with the knee.
Yep.
But who's going to identify that as the problem?
Well, and what's dangerous is you get more entrenched too, right? Because once you start to make those investments, like let's say the investment in the knee brace or the this or the that, to keep that analogy going, now you've got to keep wearing it. Like now that you've got the knee brace, now you've got to keep wearing the knee brace. And when that knee brace is insufficient, you add more knee brace. You put more money into the knee brace. And now because of whatever you want to call it, ego, hubris, whatever, now that you've gone down the path of fixing the knee with the knee brace, you're not letting go of the mistake you made. You're not going to come clean and go, I think I might have messed that up. We might not have needed that $100,000 knee brace. I think what we might have probably been better served to do is just kind of lose 10 pounds and focus on the glute strength. And that was actually like free.
Yeah, but you've got to justify your decision, which is, but I decided to put a knee brace on. And
exactly.
I mean, I had this conversation with my mom recently. The conversation was about exactly this. I was telling her the story about somebody you and I both know who's had 2 knee replacements. One that was never really been that great. And this is somebody that's quite a bit younger than my mother, but is in much worse shape. And mom's got arthritis in her knee. And I'm like, and she's like, I'm just going to keep grinning and bearing it. And it's like, yeah, basically. Like figure out the non-invasive ways to deal with it until you absolutely have to, because once you go down that road, it's really hard to turn back. But she's prepared. And here's the difference. She's prepared to suffer in the short term to a point.
Yeah. Yep.
And the other thing she's found is when she's going for her walks every day, when she's doing the things she knows work for her, it actually doesn't hurt that bad.
Yeah.
Because she's keeping things mobile and she's doing that. And she's using those older school, more traditional remedies, let's say, of just like, I'm going to be active, I'm going to be fit, I'm going to have a good diet, I'm going to be healthy, as ways to mitigate, instead of the ow, it hurts, ow, I need, hand me the bottle of Advil, ow, oh, I need a knee brace. And I think part of the challenge is, it is back to what you talked about before on culture, is the culture nowadays is, got a problem, here's a solution immediately, boom, right in your face. No one wants to take time to diagnose the problem the way you described it before. That's one issue.
Yep.
And they want immediate outcome, like we talked about. It's like, I need the win right now. Give me the win right now. Like if my team's not winning in the first quarter and they're not winning through the whole game, I'm pissed off.
Yeah.
It's like, what? Like, what are you talking about? So there's no patience for suffering or taking a longer term view. It's all, I want reward. I want it now. I want it immediately. I don't want to have I want it to be as fast and painless as possible. And I don't want to have to do any work.
Well, here's interesting. It's also the allocation of resources to the problem identification versus the allocation of resources to the solution.
Correct.
And so right now the balance is, if I've got $100,000, I'm going to put all $100,000 into the solution, or $95,000 into the solution. It's like, well, but if you just put a fraction of that money into more adequate problem identification, you might only need to spend $10,000 on the solution.
Totally.
But it's not nearly as sexy, right? So what happens is, okay, knee brace, or drugs or therapeutics, or in the case of business, it's 100 new programmers. And it's like, well, if you just would have spent 3 months understanding the problem and working through the problem, you might have, in the case that you brought up, in the example you brought up with the client we worked with, you might be saving money. Not only do you not need 100 resources, you need 40. You need to get rid of 60.
Yep. but it's the culture of action, and action being, I need to apply force to the road to go in a direction. It's not action in terms of, let me sit back and reflect and think about this and dig into it a bit more. Let me go and look at the road conditions. Let me go and look at what kind of what the composition is of the tires that are going to go on the road. Let me think about the combination of those two things. Let me do a bit of forecasting about what the weather might be and how the pressure might change. It's about, no, get the friggin' thing on the road and start ripping. Just go. And unfortunately, that's what's getting rewarded. And so those that want to sit back and be a little bit more thoughtful, that action is not viewed in this with the same respect. Let's say.
Well, that's like, even if you think of the last, I don't know, thousands of years, like, where are the philosophers of our time? Like, even that's changed just in general, right? Like, there's just maybe the words respect, like, there's less respect for thinking, taking time to think, taking time to step back from the problem and actually assess it, like, really critically too. Not just, I kind of thought about it for half an hour and we'll get 100 programmers. Like, really think about the problem. What happens now is like, hey, we need an answer like by tomorrow, like come hell or high water. And it's like, yeah, but the wrong answer is going to take us down the wrong path. I mean, we worked with a company who made the wrong bet on an ERP. Yeah, it cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
Dude, it was billions.
Well,
it was billions.
Fair enough.
I mean, those guys. I mean, yeah, that was a bad story.
Well, sure, it was hundreds of millions in software and billions of impact to the business.
Correct.
And that's just because one decision was taken, and I don't want to say it wasn't taken, with some thought, but obviously not as much as what they should have undertaken, obviously, or it wouldn't have turned out so poorly.
Yeah, but I mean, this is again the issue in that case. Like, this happens all the time, right? I've got a bookkeeping problem. You need a new ERP, right? Yeah. And somebody convinces you that instead of doing that, we'll just hire the bookkeeper. It's like, no, you need a full system. You got to automate the, and it's like, but this started out with, I have a bookkeeping problem. So even that, like, the scope creep of, the discipline to say, no, this is what it is. It's this. Fundamentally, this is what it is. And let's come up with something that's practical. But you're right. It's no. And I need to justify, we're going to blow it up. And you get into sort of what drives the incentives then in terms of budgets and power and profile in organizations, right? I mean, if you remember back to that, the people that were involved in that project on the front end of it, I mean, these were now the best and the brightest in the business. That's what was served up. You get a chance to be on the project. Oh, really? Wow. And it was aspirational. It was all driven by ego, and it was driven by, because I remember how that was sold too, is, there isn't anything like this. It's brand new. Nobody asked the question of, but where have these guys implemented this on anything?
That's first red flag.
This is a $5 billion a year organization with, a bunch of employees in multiple branches across the country. Have you ever done anything of that size? No one asked the question. We were the guinea pig. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. The paid guinea pig. We had to pay to be the guinea pig.
And you're paying for the privilege of being the guinea pig, but it got wrapped up in a bunch of hubris of, wow, it's going to be amazing. And it was a complete, utter friggin' failure. And when you think back to what, again, the core fundamental problems were that this was trying to solve, they were things like better bookkeeping. That's what they were.
Yeah.
They were not about a requirement for some giant change. It got served up that way to everybody to get to do the rah thing.
Yeah.
That's fundamentally what it was. And I think in a lot of cases, I mean, even this, right? This podcast thing, how many people have asked us what we're using for technology, and we tell them, and they're like, really? And it's like, yeah, because it works good enough for now. It's good enough.
Yeah. Yep.
Like, this is simple enough for now. We don't need to go and spend 10 grand on mics and all kinds of crazy stuff. And, for those watching, there's not two guys standing here in my office and two guys with Lorenzo. There's not. This is very basic because it can be. And maybe some people would criticize the resolution on certain, whatever. If and when this goes bigger, well, then we maybe want to invest in that. But I think, is it good enough to accomplish what you need today? But think about the incentives depending on sector, whether that's a company with now budgets that are getting handed out and budgets are power. Or think about government. Our government work with zero-based budgeting. Like
Oh,
if I don't
God.
spend it, I won't get the same budget next year. So I've got to find a way to spend this before the end of the fiscal year. It's like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of saving taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, I
Okay,
guess we
well,
did have a conversation after all.
Yeah. Have fun figuring that one out. Hey,
I know. Yeah, that'll be fun to edit up, but we'll do it.
except maybe we don't.
No, maybe we don't either. I agree. I don't know. Maybe we just leave it and let it marinate and get out there. Maybe
When
it's
we
interesting.
throw the whole thing out, like throw the
Yeah.
whole thing up. I
Yeah.
think because there's probably like 4 or 5 different segments that
Themes?
are kind of
Yeah, probably.
kind of interesting.
Mhm.
And that's how you do it.
Yeah.
We just do that.
you do it.
You just do that every week, and then we're good.
Okay. Good enough now.
Yeah.